Hey guys, welcome to our linguistics workshop number 1. Today I'm not going to give you any information, you're all fresh blood, and I want you to start this question. A small hint before starting would be to kind of look at the words on both sides and look at the similarities between words of different types. For example, the different verbs, though some are similar, and different pronouns, although some are similar. Give yourself about 5 minutes, pause and do this problem. Okay, great. So what was your first step in solving this problem?
This is Anshi. Can I try?
Sure, go ahead.
So it either half of them end with a few of them end with A, and all of those are female. So I figured when it ends with A, it's the female form of that verb, and when it ends with a consonant, it's the male form.
That's perfectly correct. Now, could you tell me if anyone figured out how you would switch from a male to a female or a female to a male word? Is there any formula you can use to convert the genders of the sentences?
Can I try again?
Can I?
Sure, the second person who answered.
Yeah, you just exchanged the last two letters.
Okay, will I exchange the last two letters or will I delete the second to last vowel and replace the last letter with A? Would I not alternate them?
Yeah, you would remove the vowel, the second last letter, and then put a at the end.
Perfect. And how do we know that? How did you get to know that?
The second to last vowel isn't always an A, so you would have to remove it and put an A.
Perfect. So if we see milmel, which is our second last word, it's an E, but in the questions we figure out that it ends with an A. And this is just one of the ways that you have to glean from the questions asked and not just focus on the data given. So I'll be going through the way that I thought and processed this question before we move on. We mainly got what we had to do. So first things first, I kind of took a quick look at the data given and just picked up the similar words. So I know that they are he and she, and they're different verbs, and there are only two verbs that reoccur, which are thought and received. And now I can kind of figure out where the verb is placed in the word in Hebrew. For example, since we have hasav and hasva, we kind of figure out that thought is the root is has, and that comes before the pronoun. As you see on the right, it can be observed that I actually switch this around. There are 5 sentences that start with she, they end with a consonant, and 3 sentences that start with she, they end with a vowel A. This is, you can just look at it and kind of figure out. You have to take a slightly, very observant mood when you're coming to tackle these questions. So now the next thing that I would be looking at is, after determining that the pronoun comes after the verb, to the right hand side of the verb, and the verbs all have a root form, I'd figure out how to switch between male and female, which we perfectly got, which was the male and the females. You have to subtract the vowel preceding the last letter, move the last letter such that it kind of slots to the left, and the last letter should be A for a female, whereas for a male you kind of keep it as a consonant. Kind of gave away the answer for the first one, but can you guys figure out the answers for the rest?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Go ahead. What's for the first one?
She
Wrinkled. She wrinkled.
Perfect. What about milmila?
He muttered.
Great. And sagar?
He, she,
He
shut.
Great, great.
Isha.
I think a really good question that Ishan asked right over here was how would you figure out if if you're given mil mila and told to convert it to a male form, how will I know it's mil mel? How do I know the vowel there's an e? That's just a quirk of the language, and you don't have the data to solve that question right now, and you don't need it for these set of questions. If the question asked for milmal, they would have given some additional data on how to find the e or any other vowels that are present in the male, which are kind of lost in the female counterpart of the verb.
I have a doubt.
Sure, go ahead.
So we know the root because of the common letters, but then how do we know which vowel and consonant come after the root? If you're finding the gender, if you're attaching it to the root, how do you figure out which consonants to use?
Perfect. That was what I kind of just explained. That it's a quirk of the language, milmel and milmila. It's easy to convert to female because you kind of omit a letter, but converting back to male is a bit more confusion. For example, if you're given sagra and told to convert it into male, as in we know that sagra is she shot. If I ask you to tell me he shut, you wouldn't know if it's sagar or sager or sagor. And that's just a quirk of the language. There are probably more rules in Hebrew that kind of allow you to navigate through these quirks, but we don't need them right now. Okay? Is stuff clear?
Okay, thanks.
Okay, great. So anytime you have a doubt, just go back to the data, and if you don't need it, you don't really need to care.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
We're not learning the language, we're just figuring out the logic behind the language, so.
Thank you.
Okay, any other doubts, or shall we proceed to the next topic? Okay, so the next topic is, I looked through this college course and they said something called the rule of minimal pairs. And I mean, they made it sound very big, but it's really just logic. If you have he sings to be this and she sings to be that, you can tell me what sings is, right? It's a pretty fairly simple question.
Circle.
Perfect. Sings would be circle because it's the only thing common. Even if you don't know whether he or she means, triangle or square, we can tell with absolute certainty that circle is sings. And this is basically the rule of minimal pairs, and this is what we need to follow as we go through the next few questions. Figure out the smallest pair that you can find and figure out something or a word that you can factor out and exploit that word as much as you can to figure out other words. And that's how we operate in linguistics. So now we have our next question over here, Akamu's table. And there's this long backstory, like a cool anime character, but that's optional to read. You can read if you want, you can read if you don't want. I would prefer if you read because it gives some more insights into the question. And the main question is asking you to fill in these blanks, and you have to understand the logic between the conversions between each language, and you also have to understand how to implement that in the new word. You can take 10 minutes for this question. You should pause the video and try that right now. And yeah, go ahead. Great. I hope you're done. You should have paused the video and tried. Now I'll be discussing the answers, or basically how I did it. I'm pretty sure most of you have done it, looking at the chat. It's very simple in the sense that you just have to figure out what remains constant and what doesn't remain constant. What doesn't remain constant is what is really important and what changes language to language, and we basically just need to tabulate that. I have used a ancient art of whitening out the spaces and kind of made sure that I can put stuff in the same table so it kind of looks more coherent to me. It may look a bit confusing to you, but you'll get used to it. It's especially confusing because it's a big table, but you'll get used to it as you keep doing questions. I would recommend taking screenshots and working on the computer when you have an online question. Now, basically, what we're doing right here is we figure out that K becomes T, and that remains T across Hawaiian, Maori, Nukuhiva, and the rest of the languages. And this is kind of constant, K starts as T and ends as T. Pardon me, K becomes T and stays as T. And this will happen to every K and every T. Now we have to find every K and every T and make this change. The same thing we can see with H in the first column itself, where H remains H for the first three languages, becomes an apostrophe in Rarotonga, and becomes an S in Samoa. And we have to do the same thing to any apostrophe S or H we find and convert the languages. I haven't put the answers right here, but it's a pretty fairly simple thing to do. There are a lot of things that stay, constant, like the A's and the I's. You don't need to bother about them. So, can you see anything common between the second and third columns? If you look closely in the Maori row, both are R's. So we know that an L becomes an R from Hawaiian to Maori. So a Maori R should go back to an L in Hawaiian. And we can kind of establish that similarity that L, R, apostrophe, something L is kind of the cycle of how words that start with how L becomes R and how that chain kind of goes and how you translate between the languages. And that's basically the question. You continue that.
The apostrophe in Nukuhiva is basically the R.
Perfect. The apostrophe in Nukuhiva is basically the R in Maori, which is the same as the L in Hawaiian. And we have to make similar, observations, for example, in the fifth row.
Yeah, both of the differences are R.
Yeah, the differences are R. So the fifth row Maori would also be R, and the fifth row Nukuhiva will also be apostrophe, and the fifth row
Yes.
actually gives us R and L to finish that chain.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Right? Of how L goes through its whole changes of going to R, going to an apostrophe, going to everything else. Yeah. I think that's one of the answers over there. Right? Yeah. Okay. And basically that's the question. You figure out all the ways to do it. For example, in the seventh we see H, WH, a gap, apostrophe, F. And we implement that with the fourth column to figure out that gap is actually H. And now we have the whole H, WH, H, apostrophe, and F scheme.
It'll be the apostrophe and UA.
Yeah, that is the answer for one of them. And that's perfect. And that's basically how you would go about solving this question. Yeah, I hope everyone understood. Does anyone have any doubts?
So everywhere the L will change to an R from Hawaiian to Maori.
Yes, everywhere the L will change to an R.
So even in the fifth column.
Over there also. And for example, I can't think of any right now, but yes, an L will change to an R from Hawaiian to Maori.
Yes.
And that will be, a fact. And that will not change. If you see any L's in Hawaiian.
Sorry to interrupt. I think I got the whole table, all the blanks.
Okay, great job. We'll keep going with the explanation.
Yeah, okay.
And I'll check your work later. Yeah, so every L becomes every R, and here I've just pulled up all the answers. Now, I might have made a few mistakes. I was kind of doing this in a hurry, but as long as you understood the logic, that's perfectly fine. That's more than enough. Logic is the only thing we're going through in this course. So even if you don't understand some of the answers, it's better. I mean, it's worse than, pardon me, better
Yes.
than not figuring out the logic behind the question. And if you're faced with a similar question, you should be able to do it, right? Now, an interesting quirk of the language, like Hebrew had the quirk where female to male is kind of more complex from male to female. This language has the quirk that there are many apostrophes. For example, uh, um, an apostrophe in the Rarotonga language can be considered an S in Samoa or an F in Samoa. Have you guys seen that? Yeah. Okay, sorry.
Are you making changes? Because I can't.
No, I'm not. Slight, technical issues. So yeah, in this apostrophe becoming an S and the apostrophe becoming an F, what's more important is how's the apostrophe becoming an apostrophe, right? I'm not making this into some philosophy session, but in the first column, you see a H becoming an apostrophe, and that apostrophe becomes an S. But in the seventh column, the apostrophe is not from the apostrophe is from a WH, which then becomes a H, which then becomes an apostrophe, and so this WH, ancestral apostrophe, is the one that becomes an F. So this is the trick they've kind of spun on the question, and you would have lost marks if you had put an S. That's just something you have to figure out and work with as experience goes. And if you put it in a table like this, where you can see the entire cycle of how letters revolve, you can figure out and avoid these mistakes as much as possible. We can do the same for the 8th and the 9th column. Of course, we have W, W, V, 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 and that is the cycle for W's and V's, and implementing that in the 9th column will give us the letters and words we need for the 9th column. Great. That is the question. It's the same thing multiple times, and it's basically that very long, very fancy sounding but very short law of minimal pairs coming into play many times. Has everyone understood?
Yes.
Yes.
Great. Then we should be pretty much done. I have explained most things in this question. I'd like you to go home and just revise and get the answers. There's so many words, so I haven't really written down all of them. Get the answers, take a picture and send it to me. That's your homework from my part of the session. And yeah, I think that's about it. I hope you guys had a great time in this session, and the next session should be coming up in a bit. For those watching the video, you can take a break for about 10 minutes right now, and whenever a longer break also works, and then return for the second session, which is less on logic and more on languages and their quirks and their similarities, and phonetics. That kind of is a very key part. Oh, something I forgot to mention here is very trivial, but it's an observation nonetheless. There are a few constants in this language without the vowels. There is no E in this language that has occurred, so we can't make any assumptions, but all other vowels are constant, and the N, from that oh no repeating, we know that the N is also constant and does not become anything, but things may turn into N. We don't know that yet. Okay, thank you for listening, guys. I hope it was a good time. I will entertain all doubts in the next session. See you.